All right, I think we are going to go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to our uh, third and final panel. This is Tax Justice, part of our fourth annual policy summit. My name is Benjamin Orr. I'm the president and CEO of the Maryland Center on Economic Policy. For those of you who don't know MedCep, we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank that believes every Marylander should be able to achieve their full potential in a healthy economy that offers a widely shared and rising standard of living. I do want to remind everyone that this webinar will be recorded and we will send the recording out afterwards. You will also see that Raquel is going to drop a sign-in link in the chat. If you wouldn't mind clicking through that and telling us a little bit more about yourself. We'd also like to begin by thanking our sponsors, the Annie Casey Foundation, the Maryland State Education Association, the NAACP, Strong Future Maryland, and the University of Baltimore College of Public Affairs. We also, you may recall, have had a drawing to distribute some signed copies of The Whiteness of Wealth by Dorothy Brown. And our winners are Alejandro Londono and Rashim Wright. So we will be in touch about how to get those books. Congratulations. And I would also encourage folks to stay all the way until the end. We have some brief remarks from Senator Cardin on the Buildback Better plan currently before the Senate. With that, I have the pleasure of introducing our moderator today. Brandon McKoy is the Vice President of State Partnerships on the State Fiscal Policy team at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. He brings 15 years of experience in social policy research, advocacy, and implementation, having served on the boards of various community organizations, advised governors on economic and tax policy, and participated in multiple task forces to advance racial and economic justice. On a personal note, I would also call Brandon a friend, and from the very beginning of our friendship, I've known that he is one of our nation's most capable policy advocates. We are so excited to have him guide today's conversation. And with that, I will hand it off to Brandon.
Thank you very, very much, Ben. It's great to be here. It's great to take part in Maryland Center for Economic Policy's conference. Just a tremendous organization that does so much good work for Maryland residents and beyond. So thank you for the opportunity. And thank you to everybody for joining us today. It's a Saturday morning, so appreciative of your efforts and intention to be here. This is going to be a very fun and interesting conversation with a bunch of panelists, some that I've known for a long time, some that I just met, but all that have tremendous love and hard work for equity and justice in our communities. And so I'm going to introduce them now, and then we will get into the conversation. The four panelists are, I'm going to go in order. Mike Mitchell is the Director of Public Policy and Research at the Groundwork Collaborative, and also a former executive at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. Dayvon Love is the Director of Public Policy at the Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. Francesca Jean Baptiste is the Director of Tax Partnerships at Cash Campaign of Maryland. And Kamolika is the State Policy Analyst at the Institution of Taxation and Economic Policy. So since I've only given your titles, could you each tell us a little bit more about yourself, your work, and your experience? And if you could go in the order that I introduced you. So Mr. Mitchell first.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Brandon. Thank you to MedCep for putting on such a fantastic event. I'm very excited to be here with all of you and with all these other wonderful experts this morning. So as Brandon mentioned, my name is Mike Mitchell. I'm the Director of Policy and Research with the Groundwork Collaborative. The Groundwork Collaborative is a nonprofit research and advocacy organization that's focused on helping to build a worldview, helping to reshape narratives at the federal and state level when we think about public policy. We work with economic policy experts, progressive movement leaders, activists at the front lines of progressive causes and communities across the country to develop and advance progressive economic worldview, to collaborate and foster new ideas, and to break down issue silos and support and amplify each other's work, which I think is especially important for our conversation today when we talk about tax policy and the importance of state level revenue in particular to a range of causes and policy issues that we care deeply about. Just in my own background, as Brandon mentioned, prior to coming to Groundwork Collaborative, I was a researcher and a senior policy analyst with the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, focused primarily on state level budget and tax policy, where I had the opportunity to do a significant amount of research into the ways in which state level revenue systems had been informed, were shaped with critical intention around solidifying racial hierarchies, and that is to say, oftentimes anti-Black hierarchies within state level policy. So I'm very excited about the opportunity to have this conversation and look forward to hearing from my other panelists as well. And I'll pass it on to Dayvon.
All right, good morning, everybody. I'm Dayvon Love, as was mentioned, Director of Public Policy, Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, from West Baltimore. Actually co-founded Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle back in 2010 with a group of friends and colleagues of mine, many of us coming out of the activity of high school and college policy debate, which is actually one of the most rigorous forms of academic debate that exists, and actually played a significant role in helping to provide much of the intellectual architecture of the conservative revolution. So if we think about post, the liberation movements of the 60s and 70s, major conservative think tanks played a role in the conservative revolution, and policy debate actually played a big role in that. And we actually entered the activity of policy debate during an intellectual and academic innovation in the activity of policy debate that challenged the research methodology and pedagogy of policy debate, it being entrenched in racism and white supremacy, and looking at developing forms of knowledge and approaches to scholarly and policy questions, from a Black liberation, African-centered perspective. So that it informed the work of Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle when we were founded. We noticed that many of the organizations advocating on issues that most directly impacted Black people were not controlled or operated, for the most part, by folks of and from our community. So we founded Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle using the kind of training that we got from policy debate. Early on, we focused a lot on criminal justice related issues. So focusing on stopping the construction of a juvenile detention facility. We've been heavily involved in police reform, but have expanded to a variety of other issues as an organization. And as I mentioned, we were founded in 2010. So we're about to go into 12 years of doing advocacy on a variety of issues. So I'll stop there.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Francesca Baptiste, and I'm the Director of Tax Partnerships at the Cash Campaign of Maryland. The Cash in our name stands for Creating Assets, Savings, and Hope. And we're a financial capability nonprofit organization that works to promote economic advancement for low to moderate income Marylanders. And we do this in a couple of different ways, but we have significant policy work at the state and federal level. And I'm excited to be here today. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Kamolika. I'm a state policy analyst at the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy, or ITEP. So if you don't know, ITEP analyzes tax proposals and provides recommendations on how to create sustainable and equitable tax systems. Personally, I'll say, before ITEP, I spent a little bit of time working on affordable housing issues with these larger progressive coalitions. And I think personally, I could never shake the fact that we wouldn't need to make these trade-offs between housing and funding mental health programs and education if we just increase taxes on the wealthy. And so, I'm really drawn to this tax policy because I just feel like all of these decisions are fundamentally a question of what do we owe one another? What kind of society do we want to create? So I'm excited to talk about that here.
You all, I would be remiss to not stand Kamolika for being from New Jersey, which I am. So thank you. It's great to be here with you. So just a quick frame for our conversation. This is, we're discussing racial equity and tax policy. And really the simple fact of the matter is that public investments have a great degree of influence over the welfare of our communities and residents, and tax policy determines how grand or how caustic those investments can be. And so from the foundation of this nation, the tax code has been shaped and molded generally by a select and privileged few. And while the past century of our history has really seen a lot of improvements with diversification of backgrounds and experiences of tax policy experts, there remain numerous ways that the tax code is still structured to privilege mostly wealthy, mostly white homeowners. first and foremost, while distinctly disadvantaging non-white residents and communities. And so it's a tremendous thing that Maryland Center for Economic Policy actually had the whiteness of wealth as a giveaway. I would urge everybody to read that book. I would urge everybody to read The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. These two texts really get into the history of US tax policy, color of law, more so housing, but still how tax policy has shaped our communities, and whiteness of wealth particularly has a racial equity lens. But at the end of the day, we cannot invest in our communities if we don't have the resources to do so. And so raising the funds to enable those investments is vital, and then making sure that those funds go to the places that they can do the most good, be big economic drivers for communities, is just absolutely crucial. When we think about how white communities gained wealth in this nation, it was through public investment. It was through land grant colleges. It was through benefits in the GI Bill. And so to see that history, to know that it is possible, and then to deny that to others is incredibly unjust. And so I'm very excited for the conversation we're going to have, and let's get right to it. For all panelists, I just want to ask a question of, well, I guess explicitly for two of you actually. We're here just to discuss the fact that we believe tax justice is racial justice first and foremost. Past choices have created a tax system that gives advantages to white and wealthy individuals, and then creating additional barriers that hold back Black taxpayers and other people of color. So Mike and Kamolika in particular, the work that you both do, it focuses on tax policies across the entire country. And so just what are some of the ways that racism and racial disparities show up in our tax system that you see? And can you focus particularly at the state and local level? And Kamolika, could you go first?
Yeah, sure. I think there are so many levels to this question, just because I feel like racism is so entrenched into our tax systems. It's kind of hard to know where to start. I think that, as Brandon mentioned, tax systems don't exist in a vacuum, but in societies that have systematically extracted wealth and wealth building opportunities from Black and Brown communities, and then while doing the exact opposite for white communities. So given this, racism shows up in what states decide to tax, like, for example, relying more on sales taxes rather than income, or taxing capital gains, income generated from existing wealth at lower rates than wages. I will say Maryland's better about that than most states. And it's not just about what states tax, but also about the practical application of taxes, like the fact that Black and Hispanic homeowners, pay tax bills 10 to 13% higher than white homeowners for similar homes. Anyway, Mike can go into the specifics of the tax system in a minute, but I just want to point out that all of this is very much rooted in history. The fact that many state tax codes generate inadequate levels of revenue, worsen racial inequality, it's not accidental, it's all by design. You see these current day lack of revenue and tax inequities, and it could be traced even, prior to the Civil War era, and a lot of longstanding efforts to protect specifically slaveholding landowners from taxation. If you look at, early colonial era, Southern colonies relied heavily on customs duties and, kind of head taxes, because all these influential large landowners, they were the ones who were objecting to land taxes. There's a historian, Robin Einhorn, who argues the Southern state constitutions adopted uniformity clauses specifically to protect slaveholders from paying special or higher taxes on slaves than on other forms of, personal property. Like Maryland had that clause, a lot of states followed. I feel like there were some inroads made during Reconstruction, but only until then former slaveholders seized power back, and, through physical violence, often, against Black politicians who had raised property taxes. And then after these so-called redeemers cut property taxes, even then you'd have local property assessors who would tax Black property owners at those higher effective rates. And I think, you also saw a lot of former Confederate states, they would divide their tax receipts by race to ensure Black schools only received the specific amount of taxes paid by Black taxpayers and not a penny more. And, then you actually see these historical tax receipts, and it shows just the opposite, that Black taxpayers were regularly paying more in taxes and subsidized white-only schools. And so anyway, I can keep going. I realized I'm probably over time, but it just feels like, that dual tax structure shows how there's bureaucratic exploitation, and then that exists in tandem with more outright racial violence. You see it in like the beginning of the sales tax. And then this overarching story is that all this history has led to these present day tax codes that, generally speaking, help wealthy white households accumulate wealth, while primarily Black and Hispanic households are left with even lower post-tax incomes than they were pre-tax. And then that has huge implications on who gets to have influence over new policies. So I'll turn it over to Mike.
Thanks, Kamolika. So as Kamolika was saying, you can look through history and see the ways in which tax policy has been shaped by white supremacy, but you can also look then at present day and see that as a result of decades worth of this kind of policymaking and this ideology that's driven in many cases. So as you're thinking about the present day revenue systems, and you can think about this at the federal level, and you can think about this across the states, I would invite people to think about the ways in which this approach has weakened revenue systems in three ways. The first is that this has made state level revenue systems deeply regressive. And this means that if you're on the lower end of the income spectrum, you're paying a much higher share of your incomes as taxes than you are if you're at the high end of the income spectrum. And this happens because states are oftentimes less reliant on income taxes, more reliant on sales taxes. As Kamolika was mentioning, in many states, folks saw the sales tax as a way to ensure that low-income Black people were paying into the system, and a way to shift away from higher-income whites who they felt were more deserving. The ways in which we tax wealth. In many states, there lack the mechanisms to actually capture wealth in many states, or they're relatively weak in what they're able to actually recoup. And then there are also a range of other policies that states either poorly invest in or haven't fully taken the opportunity on. And I'm thinking in those instances, such as like the EITC, where states have the opportunity to latch on and kind of piggyback off the federal earned income tax credit to help low-income families to thrive. So that's the first one, is that state level tax policies are oftentimes very regressive. I think you could take a step back and also just acknowledge that state level policies are often weak. And this unfortunately has a history in, it has a history in a lot of states that decided, as opposed to stepping up and ensuring that public services and folks in their states had the ability to access robust, well-funded services, felt that there was the other approach would be to actually dramatically cut revenue that was available to the state, and actually step back from providing those things to anyone if it meant that Black people were going to benefit in any way, shape, or form. And Brandon had mentioned a few other books. One other one I might recommend is Eric Foner's Reconstruction. It has a fantastic piece in there that really deals with the ways in which there was a brief moment in Southern history in particular, where states tried to step up, state and local governments tried to step up to provide greater services, and it was met with significant backlash. And it just led to a range of different policies being put in place that restricted the ability of states even to raise significant revenue. And that leads into my third point, which is that oftentimes revenue systems are dramatically rigged, either through the invention of supermajority requirements, which mean that state legislatures have to reach this significantly higher threshold to pass revenue raising legislation. The other ways in which property taxes are not allowed to increase at a rate that allows for the kinds of investments that local governments want to make, and pushes them into really bad tax policy in the other direction. Or, for instance, in Maryland, the ways in which the legislature isn't able to increase the kinds of investments they want to beyond what the governor proposes. So these ways in which even the rules of the game are confined such that they lead to the kinds of outcomes that harm low-income folks, harm predominantly Black and brown people, and leave us all worse off. So I'll stop there and hand it back over to Brandon.
Both very much. Francesca and Dayvon, you both see up close on a daily basis just what effects these kinds of tax policies have on Marylanders' day-to-day lives. What are some of the ways that you see Maryland's tax system creating or strengthening barriers to opportunity for Black and brown Marylanders?
You want me to go first?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. All right. So good morning again. So I think for me, this question, I think, requires some conversation around the economic models or the models of economic development that are often buttressed by tax policies. So we think about the neoliberal model of, jurisdictions bringing in big corporate entities to provide jobs, expand the tax base, expand the budget to provide services. When that becomes the basis of the economic model, and that has been really the basis of the economic model, at least for the past 50 to 60 years in the United States, a part of what that does and what that has done in Baltimore is that one of the fastest growing industries has been the service sector. And so with the emergence of service sector jobs being what's most available, that undermines the ability, particularly for working class, Black and brown folks to have access to the kinds of opportunities that can sustain a reasonable quality of life. And so when we think about, the way that tax policies are structured in a way that in many ways protect assets and those who are high income earners, that has and that the economic model is constructed around those in the top 10%, the top 1%'s ability to essentially dominate the nature of how the economy and the economic models that are put out there are configured. Again, it puts Black folks in a precarious economic position. And I think it's only when we start to think about economic models that are more empowering, economic models that don't center those who are the top income earners, but in fact, think about other approaches to economic development that really help to empower local communities. That I think that is kind of a model that pushes back against the way that the society has structured and the way that tax policies buttress economic models that are disempowering to Black people, and then again, relegate many Black folks in places like Baltimore to service sector jobs that don't provide much upward mobility for those for whom that's the kind of employment they have the most access to.
Okay, good morning again. So I think what we have really been hearing is that the tax code is just upside down and that it really hasn't been working that well for everyone. And one of the biggest issues is that the tax code is just not written for communities of color. While there are tax credits that do work to boost the success of lower income people who are disproportionately Black and brown, many other tax provisions do overwhelmingly go to higher income white people, which we've been hearing. As mentioned before, tax deductions for mortgage interest and real estate taxes, or the lower tax rate on capital gains income, just to name a few. Our average client is a person of color that makes about $20,000 a year. They're likely not able to take advantage of any of these opportunities in the way that higher income, mostly white people are. And then these issues start at the federal level, and of course they trickle down to Maryland. Maryland piggybacks on these federal policies and really only recently has started to decouple from the federal tax code that we can all agree is just moving way too slowly to change to support the needs of Black and brown communities. The other issue is that the tax code adds a layer of complexity that our clients just don't understand. I can't tell you how many people who are actually single filers come to us and tell us they're heads of households. And it makes sense, right? It makes sense to them. They are providing all the support to the household they live in, but they don't understand that that's a specific term of art within the code and that has specific requirements and tests. So oftentimes they'll make these kinds of mistakes on their tax return, and it's not because they're trying to commit fraud or anything like that, but because they simply don't understand. It's the same with the many tax credits. As Maryland, again, is coupled with the federal return, once there's an improper payment at the federal level, that issue trickles down to the state return, which again causes issues for the taxpayer on both ends, just further worsening their situation. I can go on, but I'll just leave it there.
Question for you, Kamolika. For many states, and Maryland is among them, the slow economic recovery following the Great Recession from approximately 10 years ago led to many years of slow revenue growth. Jersey was the same. And so many state and local governments responded to this by cutting services, freezing state employee pay, other similar measures, instead of taking steps to raise revenue. So can you talk a bit about why this approach is harmful to communities in general, regardless of background and ethnicity, but particularly harmful to communities and people of color?
Sure. I always think it's really funny, not funny, but how a lot of these like right-wing, or not even right-wing, I shouldn't even say that. A lot of politicians always think that it's a great time to cut taxes. If the economy is in the tank, then somehow cutting government programs, laying off workers is supposed to help. If the economy is doing well, their solution is to also cut taxes rather than use that opportunity to build even stronger programs. Not to mention the fact that usually when people state like the economy is doing well, it ignores the fact that it's, often still failing people of color, especially women of color. I think in terms of the Great Recession, it had pretty much like devastated state revenues by late 2008. I think in response, most states, like many states raised taxes, but several made some modest tax cuts, and most of those increases were temporary. A lot of the more substantial tax cuts came later during that Tea Party wave. The problem was that as soon as revenues even slightly began to recover, the state politicians went and prioritized these like huge, deep tax cuts rather than restoring spending. Again, kind of seeing that now. And then this tax cutting means that a lot of states are spending way less even like now than they were even before 2007. And honestly, like I feel like we often make that comparison, and a lot of states weren't spending enough even then. So I think it's sometimes like a silly comparison to make. I still want to point it out, and at the same time, there are so many studies that show that states that cut spending during the Great Recession saw their economies grow more slowly than the rest of the nation. So it's not only does it not work, we kind of they continue to use these narratives. And then as the question states, like this tax cutting is particularly harmful to communities of color. For a number of reasons. At this very, very basic direct level, Black workers are overrepresented in state and local workforce. So any budget cuts and layoffs disproportionately harm Black middle class workers. And that's because of often discrimination in the private market. Eliminating public sector jobs that are often unionized and include benefits. This eliminates these really important economic opportunities for Black workers who've been systemically denied these similar jobs, like I was saying, in the private sector. Black retirees are more reliant on public pensions. So cuts to public pensions disproportionately hurt Black workers. And on top of that, we know that when states can't come up with enough revenue, can't share enough revenue with localities, those localities need to come up with the money somewhere. Often they rely on these really regressive fines and fees to close those gaps. And there are studies that show that the use of fines and fees is deeply connected to the proportion of residents who are Black. And then of course, like this then continues into a lot of like other, issues with the criminal justice system. And so, I think like we're just seeing this total redux of the post-recession right now. There are these huge tax fights coming, and a lot of it just relies on narratives that are, kind of like racist dog whistles, and there's just no truth behind them.
Mike, in particular, some of your past work has focused on the ways in which state and local fiscal policies, particularly tax policies, can be a powerful force for dismantling racial barriers. Just what are some of the key principles that policymakers should consider in working to create a more equitable tax system?
Sure. So if I put forward this frame in the last response I gave, where we're seeing regressive weak and rigged tax systems currently, I would recommend flipping those things around as ways in which lawmakers can improve on them, right? So if you're talking about regressive tax systems, how can we make them more progressive? So how do you strengthen a state income tax to put in place more brackets on the high end, simplified brackets on the low end, make sure that you've got a really strong standard deduction at the low end so that you can really make things simple for folks when they're low income. Improve wealth taxation. Make sure that folks who, when they pass, that if your state doesn't have an estate tax, make sure that's in place so that you're capturing that well. How do you update your sales tax to make sure that you're not just taxing kind of physical activity, but you're also taxing services? We know that as you move up the income spectrum, you're more likely to engage in accessing various services. And in many states, those things may not be taxed the same way that if you did that activity yourself and you're out and actually purchasing various items, right? A lawnmower might be taxed, but having a lawnmower service might not be, for instance. That's just for example. How do you expand your state level earned income tax credit or the child tax credit? You don't have to wait for the federal government, in fact, to increase those things to boost it at the state level. You can take that on yourself in your state. And then, as Kamolika mentioned, eliminating fees and fines. These are remarkably regressive, harmful, damaging, and I will say ineffective. Like, they are actually not effective. You spend more trying to collect the fees and fines than you actually get in actually imposing them. It's ridiculous. And if you don't want to get rid of them, fine. Make them dependent on income, so that if someone is low income, it's a much smaller impact on them than if someone is high income. And that actually might impact some of the incentives that I don't know if that actually would impact some of their incentives given law enforcement's underlying motivations at times, but that is a thing you can examine and question. So if you're talking about regressive, those are things you can do there. If it's a weak system, then not only how you shift your income tax, but boost it. Gather more income at the high ends. Look for ways in which you can tax corporations. At the state level, corporate taxation is oftentimes paltry, absolutely paltry. And it is in many places, you can see the ways in which state corporate tax revenues have been falling in many places, especially as a share of state GDP. One thing that really needs to be addressed, and if there's not movement at the federal level, states need to continue to do more. How do you tax carbon pollutants? How do you make sure that you are understanding what kinds of environmental impact is happening, and how can tax policy help to not only raise revenue, but also address that issue? And then, as I mentioned, the rigged rules. So examining ways in which supermajority requirements or other kind of fiscal rules might rig the system in ways where you can only cut taxes, or you can cut spending, but you can't actually increase spending. Think about ways in which property tax limitations continue this kind of push and suppression of revenue that local governments need. I would also, really lean into what Francesca was saying. And there are ways in which states, and we talk about this at the federal level in simplifying tax systems, but states could be the leader on this too. States can be thinking about, how do we improve the ways in which individuals engage with our state level revenue departments, and make it easier for them, one, to make sure they understand their tax system and what they might owe in taxes, and two, to help reduce those kinds of incidents that oftentimes lead to audits that are completely unnecessary, and are in no way, shape, or form tied to any kind of intent, but rather an impact of just how you interact with the system. And there's a lot of really great reporting that's come out in the past couple of years that shows the IRS spends more time and more energy going after low-income folks because they don't have the funding to go after real tax cheats at the high end of the income spectrum, or corporations. And that is absolutely embarrassing. So those are the ways in which I would think that states can really be tackling this. Really make sure you don't have a regressive, do not have a weak revenue system. So that would be my response, Brandon.
Has begun his campaign for the next head of the Fed. That's basically what that is right there. I'll make a quick point also on top of what you just said, Mike, which is fire. There are democracy implications here too, right? In a post-Citizens United world where money equals speech, and we fail to have fair tax policy, letting the very wealthy and rich corporations just continue to hoard money allows them to also continue to impact our political system in a way that everyday folks have no opportunity or chance to match. And so in this moment of, I would say, democratic crisis, tax policy has a role to play here to make sure that we are not rigging the game, as Mike so eloquently pointed out. I have a question for Dayvon. Just as we've been talking about, a lot of people assume tax policies are race neutral or colorblind simply because they aren't reported or stated explicitly during policymaking. This obviously isn't true. So what are some of the challenges that you see the Black community that you work with in Baltimore because of past decisions?
So just some context that I think everybody in this conversation, I think, would agree to. The enslavement of people of African descent, genocide of Native peoples set in motion a level of wealth acquisition on the part of white folks in the United States collectively that made possible, the American nation state. And so the policies that emanate from that center of power are going to protect the interest of those at the top. And so when we go back to the conversation around economic models, one of the excuses that is often made as to why, taxing the wealthy and taxing wealth, one of the arguments we get against it is that folks will leave, right? That these major corporations will leave and will undermine the ability for municipalities to be able to generate revenues, right? That's often the response that's given. And when we think about the nature of the American political economy, where if we use the plantation as a metaphor, right, where those who, one of the things that Hubert Henry Harrison says in The Negro and the Nation in 1919, the difference between chattel slavery prior to the Civil War and, what we had after the Civil War is that enslavement chattel slavery was enforced by brute force, whereas afterwards, wage slavery is enforced by starvation, right? And so we think about that. So the basic architecture of the American political economy is such that those who are the biggest beneficiaries of that legacy of chattel slavery and indigenous genocide essentially are able to control not only just the nature of the economy, but many of the narratives of how the economy is structured. And so while I think all of you have illuminated the fallacy in much of the status quo tax policy, that in many ways benefits those who maintain power and privilege, they're able to project a narrative of the necessity of corporations and major financial institutions needing to be in a position to generate more wealth and frame that as if that's something that's good for our community, right? And I even remember, engaging or watching a conversation with someone from, the Greater Baltimore Committee who was having a conversation, just with folks in the community during the uprising in 2015 here in Baltimore. And one of the things that was said was that many of the policies that were pushed by the Greater Baltimore Committee, the tax breaks for corporations and developers and that being devastating to Baltimore. And the response that was given from the representative of the Greater Baltimore Committee was that our policies do benefit you. It's a matter of helping you all understand how, right? And so I think that frame, it's the ability to push forward that narrative. And so when we talk about the issue of race neutrality, like it is an instrument to maintain, white monopoly capitalism and to maintain the dominance of major white institutions and the collective economic and political position that white folks collectively operate in, putting Black folks and people of color more broadly in an economic subordinate position. And so I just think for me, the plantation metaphor is important, not even in just understanding the structure of our political economy and how it is fundamentally rooted in white supremacy as a system, but again, also the narratives, right? And I think it's really important that as we think about, in terms of policy advocacy, how we push against the dominance of this narrative, that is what is good for corporations and the so-called job creators is what's good for the community. I think we have to understand that the plantation metaphor also applies to the narratives by which those at the top are able to project messages that say that what's best for them is best for all of us. So it's important for us to push back against that.
Since we're throwing books around here, there's a really tremendous book by Robin Einhorn called American Taxation, American Slavery that gets into some of the things Dayvon was talking about, which is, there's been a lot of attention on, slaveholders of the past, some presidents who engaged in that. But it looks at how Southern states, slaveholding plantations really shaped tax policy to support chattel slavery, of course, and how a lot of those things still follow through today. So when, the point, Dayvon, you're making about, plantation as a conception of economic power and structure, that is really steeped in the foundation of the nation, not just with regards to privileging, wealthy folks, but where does that wealth come from? How is it created? And what was it meant to serve? Francesca, a question for you, at Cash, part of your mission is accomplished through direct service programs, providing tax assistance to low-income families, increasing access to financial education, which is all tremendous stuff. Why are these services so central to the broader fight for tax justice in the tax system? And could you give us any examples of the things that the clients you and your tax prep partners serve? What are the things that they're struggling with?
Great question. So these services are incredibly important because they're creating assets, savings, and hope. We're not just providing a transaction, but we are providing access, education. We're taking the time to talk with people about their taxes and their financial lives in a way that most paid preparers just don't. We're trying to connect these folks to safe financial products like savings bonds so that they can save for their children's futures or to start an emergency fund. We're busting through the myth that lower income people can't or don't want to save. Also, VITA or volunteer income tax assistance programs are free. They're free 99. And our volunteers undergo rigorous tax law training every single year and certify with the IRS so that we are ensuring that we're preparing accurate tax returns. There are countless of unscrupulous tax paid preparers that are charging hundreds of dollars in fees just to prepare returns without actually speaking with the taxpayer or understanding their circumstances, and they're just making up a lot of stuff. Often these fees will come out of anticipated refunds that are based on this incorrect information. And then of course, when the IRS does an investigation and disallows these payments, these folks are required to not only pay back the money, but it's also going to include interest and penalties, making their situation, again, all the worse. And we see this happening over and over again in our most vulnerable communities, our Black and Brown communities, our immigrant communities. It is incredibly troubling. We're actually fortunate that we live in a state that regulates paid tax preparers in some shape or form, but they still continue to be a problem. There needs to be a little bit of a closer look at what the industry is doing because it's a problem that's not going away. I recently spoke with a client who just realized that the tax preparer that was well known in her community that everybody went to had entered in thousands of dollars in losses on every year of her tax return for the previous 3 years. And she came to us because she couldn't understand why she wasn't getting access to any of her stimulus payments. And one of the reasons is because the IRS wanted some more information about those fraudulent tax returns. And so we were trying to help her work through all of that stuff. But as you can see, the system is again, in a way, not set up well for folks like that we're serving for our communities, because here you have someone who's trying to access funds that they desperately need through the stimulus, and they cannot get access to them because these payments are being held up for reasons that they actually don't, that aren't their fault really. Although when you sign a tax return, of course, you're saying that you are signing it under penalty of perjury and that you understand everything that's on the tax return. But of, nobody takes the time to explain it to folks, like what is actually going on in the tax return. And, this woman couldn't believe that happened to her. And it just happens quite often and in a way that is, again, directly affecting our most vulnerable communities, and something needs to be done about that.
We're nearing the end here. For folks who are watching, we're going to take some questions at the end, so please submit them into the chat. As we wrap up, for everybody, just obviously continuing to fight for public policy that serves all Marylanders is vital. And so, for those who are working on state policy in Maryland, what are some of your legislative priorities for the upcoming year? And for everybody, just what next steps can the audience take to advance tax justice? And we'll go in the order that I introduced you all to start. So Mike, then Dayvon, then Francesca, then Kamolika. Sure. And please keep it to 50 seconds.
How long? Okay, I do this real quick. I mean, so right now, I think I'm really invested in the Buildback Better legislation that's going through the Senate currently, and I think one of the most significant shifts that's happened in tax policy over the past few years is currently being debated on whether or not it'll continue. It's the making the child tax credit into a monthly benefit. It does a fantastic amount of work to lift, to eliminate child poverty. It is a much better alignment of people's real life finances when they get the benefit month to month than it is just in a lump sum at the end at the end of a tax year. And the fact that is something that is potentially not going to continue would be absolutely devastating. So I would say that for me, that's where a lot of attention is, and it should be very clear that that's something that needs to be continued beyond just next year.
So Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, we're actually going to be really involved in the fight for cannabis legalization in 2022. We've got an indication from leadership of our legislature that that's an issue that's going to be taken up, and it's something that's happening around the country. LBS's focus on that, though, is going to be around the tax revenues, so making sure the tax revenues come back to the communities most impacted by the war on drugs. And one of the things that's happened in other states is that you have many of the corporate, big box, white-led nonprofit organizations that have kind of circled the wagons to see themselves as doing the social equity portion, many states have called it, as it relates to getting money back into the community. And so we're advocating an approach that wants those tax revenues to go directly back into the communities impacted by the war on drugs, because merely dealing with the criminal justice implications doesn't do enough to do the reparative work that needs to be done to make up for the harm that's been done. So that's something, if you go to lbsbaltimore.com or Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle on all your relevant social media, you'll be able to keep up and help to support our legislative effort during the 2022 General Assembly that starts in January.
50 seconds, I'll try. So CASH always has a very robust legislative agenda, but we've worked really hard these past couple of years to expand the Maryland Earned Income Tax Credit. And of course, we've seen some big successes in the past year. And sadly, it took a global pandemic to really get what we've been asking for. But we need many of these expansions to be permanent. Right now, a lot of them are only for the next 2 years. So we really want and are going to continue to work to make these credits permanent fixtures. So what we're going to be, again, focused on is that permanence, and essentially, that tax justice is really what we're going to be working towards through the Earned Income Tax Credit.
All right, I'll say ITEP's #1 priority is to just try and preserve income taxes in all the states it's being threatened, just actually in a lot of places, Iowa, West Virginia, Mississippi, Georgia. I'll say in Maryland specifically, ITEP's definitely behind the supports the Maryland Fair Funding Coalition, their priorities. I would say, you keep hearing about how, oh, your state surplus is through the roof, like compared to what? Maryland's been trying to get more funding for education for how long? And, when you compare it to actual need, is it really a surplus? So I think just make sure to be thinking about that and follow ITEP.
For our audience members, please put any questions you have in the box. I'm going to ask one more question for each panelist Also, a 60-second lightning round response, please. What is one thing that you want everybody to take away from today's conversation? And let's go in reverse order. Kamolika, why don't you go first, then Francesca, Dayvon, and Mike.
Oh man, changing it up. Yeah, I think that, everything that we've been talking about, everything that we need tax revenue for, adequate school funding, affordable housing, like this is all a choice. I think the fact that people don't have enough to eat or that are living in substandard housing, like we can actually make a difference on all of this. And so, yeah, let's do it.
Yeah, I would just say that there's still a lot of work to do, as we've all been talking about all the things that we're steadily going to be working on, but that we just can't do it alone. We need all hands on deck. So it's important to just be paying attention to these issues, to not be thinking, oh, these things don't affect me, this doesn't matter. It really, really does. We need to be thinking about everyone, our neighbors, this whole world. We can't do it alone. So if you're ever thinking, oh, this is something that doesn't matter to me, it doesn't mean that you can't be interested. It doesn't mean that you can't do anything about it. And maybe it doesn't fit your situation, but maybe someone else. So you want to spread the word. I know that at CASH, we're always looking for people to come testify in Annapolis about how any of these expansions might affect their lives. So again, just really be paying attention, be thinking about this stuff, and always go to the ballot box and make your voice heard.
So as a person who, is publicly, avowedly, Pan-African nationalist in my politics, rooted in the tradition of Black liberation, one of the key aspects to that worldview and framework is around the distribution of resources to those who are the least of these. And those who see themselves as adherents to that tradition, this area of policy is significantly important, both in terms of driving different kinds of economic models that are more empowering of local communities, but also in challenging the corporate monopolies that oftentimes are positioned with a level of power in order to make policy, not just in terms of economic policy, but situates certain industries and certain corporate entities in a position to make policies about a whole range of other aspects of our lives. And so I think, again, those who see themselves as adherents to the kind of radical politics that I mentioned in the very beginning of this response, this is an area of policy that I think is vitally important to address.
I spoke a little bit earlier about Reconstruction, and I think that's just an important thing to kind of ruminate on. It was this moment and this opportunity where for the first time here, Black people had the autonomy to try and build a system that would work for them. And I would say by making sure it worked for them, it worked for everybody. That experiment was snuffed out because, and there's a fantastic quote by a researcher. Her name is Vanessa Williamson. I use it almost any time I talk about tax policy, but people who tried to extinguish that experiment understood that, tax policy had within it, and taxes have within it the power and the opportunity of emancipation. I want to challenge people, and as they walk away from this, to see taxes as a tool for liberation, right? It can be the foundation for the kinds of investments that give people, and as Dayvon said, not the wealthy, not corporations, gives people the control over their lives and their opportunities. And I would really, really just want to emphasize, as folks walk away from here, as they hear conversations about tax policy in their own states, in their own localities, at the federal level, as they interact with lawmakers, or as they are lawmakers, they understand taxes in that light, and they pursue just tax policy with the idea of emancipation.
I will quickly just say one more person I would like for everybody to know about and engage with is Derrick Hamilton, who's a stratification economist and has done so much tremendous work of reframing how we think about these issues, and has really helped sort of peel back the curtain and help us understand that none of the ways that we're actually thinking about these things is new. It's just that there's been this massive campaign on behalf of the wealthy and the privileged to limit our country's understanding of tax policy, something that is obviously structured in a way to be confusing and difficult to engage with. But that, as Mike said, Vanessa Williamson's quote, has the power to be a very liberative force if we structure it and implement it in the right way. And I think you can see a lot of examples from the Great Recession alone of states that, as Kamolika and others were saying, states that cut budgets, states that cut taxes, cut services, had a rough time. And states that actually said this is a moment for us to dig in, to prevent poverty from expanding, to stop hunger from worsening. Their experience of the recession, while still difficult, was way better. And that is all the example I think we all need to understand the power of policy. Policy is not everything, but at the end of the day, policy is the rules. And so if we're going to have rules, let's make sure rules are giving are working towards justice and working towards liberation. We don't have any questions in the chat. I want to give people like another 15 seconds of the opportunity to write something, because these are really tremendous panelists that I learn from every day, and that have taught me so much. But given I'm not seeing anything, and given it is 11 a.m. on a Saturday morning, I think I will kick it to Ben. Thank you, Ben. And thank you all panelists.
Well, I just want to say thank you. This has been such a great panel, and I hope people will watch this recording. I think, Brandon, your comment about how these aren't new ideas is so true. I actually recently discovered that the minimum wage, for example, is not a new idea. There's actually minimum wages in the Code of Hammurabi about 4,000 years ago. So, these are concepts we've known about for a long time. We just need to put them forward. I see we did get one question in, Brandon. So maybe you want to. And now we're getting some more. So I'm going to step back and allow you to step forward.
I can answer one question I see asking, is the new child tax credit, I assume, here to stay? That is to be determined if Buildback Better passes. If it does not pass before the end of the year, the concern is that those payments will cease. There is a bit of window that it could pass in January, and those payments will continue. But there's a very influential gentleman in West Virginia that's determining all of that. So stay tuned. And then there's a question of, could people speak to how tax policy and education funding can or cannot serve racial justice? And that is, you talk about open up Pandora's box. Anybody want to tackle that one?
I mean, I think other folks can speak specifically to Maryland, but taxes are a tool. Taxes, education, I think of them as any kind of tool, and they can be wielded in a way that is for people's benefit, or they can be wielded as methods of oppression. And unfortunately, for a long part of our history, policy more broadly, but you can look at education and tax policy have been wielded as tools to maintain current hierarchies of race and the status quo. And so, to your question, it's about who is making decisions, how are they held accountable, and how do you wield tax policy to do the things that we've been talking about, to actually expand and expand opportunity as opposed to solidify our current situation.
Yeah, and I think just to add on to that, I would say that we wouldn't want to. I think, as Mike said, it's a tool. It's not it's not a panacea. I don't think that tax policy is going to be in any way sort of like overturning all of the different the numerous types of discrimination and racism that people face every day, and that like the impacts of what's been going on for centuries and centuries. I don't think that's possible, but I think it's the idea of like, can you make things better or worse? Like, are you worsening the situation? And I think like similarly with education, I think Derrick Hamilton has written about this quite a bit. I think education on its own, I mean, it's all just part of a puzzle, right? Like, I think that, you know, we need to be working on this from many, many different sides. And, you know, I think tax is a really important one, but it's definitely not the end all be all.
I was just gonna, go ahead, Dayvon.
Well, yeah, I was just going to say, I think, you know, tax policy, education funding, I would say that they're necessary, but not sufficient. And the reason that I say that is because I think the policy change, particularly in terms of the redistribution of resources, is essential. I think one of the places, though, that I think is important, particularly those who are progressives, those that are on the left side of the political spectrum, oftentimes the public sector is characterized in many regards as a solution to a lot of problems in and of itself. And I think it's very important that as we advance these kinds of policies that we've talked about this morning, that we're also clear about some of the work that has to be done in the public sector to make sure that it is more racially just, right? Because many of the issues that I talked about that happen with corporations, there is this issue in the public sector where you have like white folks for whom the business model of Black suffering is a part of what sustains the business model, right? And that we have in the public sector a lot of what I call disaster management, right? Which are policies that are more about rendering our communities dependent on institutions outside of our communities, as opposed to empowering our communities to be self-sufficient and be able to have a relationship to these systems as an empowering one, and not one that's a kind of colonial dependent one. And so I think it's important to, you know, so just having both in mind at the same time, that pushing for these policies that will move the redistribution of resources greater into the hands of people, while also making sure that we interrogate the public systems in a way that actually makes sure those resources are empowering to the communities that the rhetoric intends for these policies to empower.
Brandon, I was just going to add that, you know, I think education, we've had this debate here in Maryland over the last 4 or 5 years around education funding, and just in last regular legislative session, the legislature gave the final override to the governor's veto of the expansion of education funding. But it was really, you know, one of the things we found in our research was that the old formula, which had race nowhere in it, was incredibly, its outcome was an incredibly racist one, in that more than half of Black students in Maryland attended school in a substantially underfunded district, compared to only 13% of white students. Incredible disparities in education funding, and funding is directly related to the quality of the education that you get. I think the other point I would make is, I think is very clearly tied into what Dayvon was just saying, in that education is not sufficient. And you might folks might look at the paper that we released yesterday, looking at the state's workforce development budget through a racial equity lens, and building on some of the work by the Economic Policy Institute, showing that you know, highly educated Black workers face barriers in the labor market worse than you know, similar or less educated white workers with criminal records. So I would point people towards that paper. I'm sure we can put that in the chat or share it afterwards. But that education is not sufficient. And the other point I would make is that, you know, regardless of your education level or what kind of job you have, you ought to be able to make ends meet. You ought to be able to put food on your table and a roof over your head. So all jobs should be good jobs. But it's an example of where race doesn't have to appear anywhere in the law in order for it to have a racialized outcome. And that's what we're concerned about in many of these conversations.
I'll just quickly add, you know, I'm from New Jersey. Up until 2 months ago, I was Ben's colleague in New Jersey. I was the Ben Orr of New Jersey, leading the SPP group here. New Jersey is often ranked #1 or #2 for education in the country. Our education system is funded by property taxes, which creates segregative effects, right? So we're a very diverse state, or a very segregated state. You know, intensely majority Black communities or majority white communities with a very, very little diversity whatsoever. And we do have what I think most would consider racially forward laws. The Abbott decision in our Supreme Court, which said that all students deserve a certain level of education, and that was from the 80s. And there's been, I think, 13 decisions to follow it up. And still, the disparity in educational quality and access is massive in New Jersey. Now, many people would argue that the least performing schools in New Jersey are still really good compared to some of the best performing schools elsewhere. But this is a matter of segregation and disparity. And there are ways to fix this that would require, having a more comprehensive tax code where maybe the state steps in and, supplements local funding for schools in a way that reduces property taxes. But when you have high wealth communities that can pay $30,000 a year in property tax versus Trenton, where I live, where, it's a lot of poverty and people can't afford high property taxes, and that's what's funding your school districts. That is a built-in advantage for white communities. And so we are actually exploring the idea of county school systems like you have in Maryland, I believe. And that is going to be interesting because Princeton and Trenton are in the same county. Newark and Short Hills are in the same county. And we're going to see how those folks, there's a lot of Black Lives Matter signs in Princeton. We're going to see how much that holds up. But it is a challenge no matter where you are, because at the end of the day, our tax policy systems just aren't very comprehensive. We lean too far one way or the other. I don't see any other questions. I don't know if anybody else wants to say anything, but thank you all. We appreciate the time.
Thank you again to this great panel and to our audience. This has been a tremendous, I think somebody in the chat said this is a great way to great conversation to have over breakfast. I also really want to thank everyone who joined over the course of our two-day policy summit. We've had powerful and insightful conversations this week about how we can advance racial and economic justice in Maryland, including policies that help ensure working Marylanders receive fair wages in a safe workplace, opportunities for increasing access to safe, affordable housing across the state, and this conversation today about taxation. Before you go, we do have a few brief closing remarks to share from Maryland Senator Ben Cardin, focusing on the themes we have discussed throughout this conference and also sharing some information about the Buildback Better legislation that the Senate is preparing to take up and which came up briefly in today's conversation. Senator Cardin was unable to join us live, so this is a recorded session, so we won't be able to offer a Q&A session with him, but we do really appreciate him taking the time to share his thoughts in this recorded video. And so please.
Hi, I'm Senator Ben Cardin. It's a pleasure to be here, even virtually with you, all at this annual summit. Throughout my time on Capitol Hill, the Maryland Center for Economic Policy has been an invaluable partner and ally in advocating for legislation that helps the people of Maryland. I am honored to be here today for this timely discussion about justice and civic accountability as it relates to the challenges facing Marylanders. Over the course of this Economic Justice Policy Summit, you have heard about ways the state can better support working Marylanders and their families, ensure everyone can have access to safe, affordable housing, and create a fair tax system that asks everyone to pay their fair share instead of reinforcing income and wealth gaps and widening the racial disparities. Along with my colleagues in the Senate, I am working tirelessly to make sure that these needs are met. The Buildback Better Act, which passed the House in November and which we must pass in the Senate, provides historic funding levels for programs that expand economic opportunities for low and middle income Marylanders. To name a few, this act would cut taxes for low and middle income families, reduce child poverty and hunger, create and expand opportunities for affordable housing, extend healthcare coverage, and more. So, to support our workers, the Act invests in development and funding for federal job training programs to prepare folks for quality jobs in fast-growing sectors. It does so by increasing the Labor Department's annual spending on workforce development by 50% for each of the next 5 years. and increasing the maximum Pell Grant awards, supporting 85,000 students in Maryland who rely on that program. The Act also provides $150 billion in funding for affordable housing and community development. That includes a $65 billion investment in the nation's public housing infrastructure and $24 billion for housing vouchers. This investment will support extremely low-income families and will target households experiencing or at risk of homelessness, survivors of sexual assault, domestic violence, and trafficking. Finally, the Buildback Better Act extends programs such as the Child Tax Credit and the Earned Income Tax Credit, which will significantly reduce poverty across the country. The Act goes as far as to make the CTC refund permanent for families who need it the most. And an extension of the EITC will provide a tax cut of up to $1,500 for 263,000 low-wage workers in Maryland. All in all, I am proud of the progress we have already made and optimistic for what is to come. I will continue to fight for federal resources that invest in the people of Maryland and look forward to all that we can accomplish together.
Thank you, everybody, and hope you have a great weekend. We'll be sending all these resources and the recording next week. Thank you.